get this working properly. So I've got a large body of information to share with you. This whole thing stretches to a 4-day intense course if you really want to go into it in depth. So I'm just going to fly at 20,000 feet and just touch the main headlines just to set a context for the discussion in half an hour's time. So just bear with me. I'm not going to take questions during this presentation. I'm going to go as quickly as I can, but hopefully you'll get the gist of what I'm saying. So let's put this in context. Google, Perplexity, GPT, etc. Query percent of ERP implementations not delivered what was promised at the strategic executive level. 70%, 70%. Somebody reported a couple of days ago, 80%. I've heard a figure of up to 95%. And why is that happening? And that figure's been around for 20 plus years. A couple of success stories on my side: V3 Consulting Engineers, cubic business model, audit efficiencies, massive management information, profitability improved, did it with one less bookkeeper. Another case, ASCO, so successful that they had to build a bigger distribution center, positioned as an industry leader in the management information and brand management, secured the Dior account, which is a very prestigious account in their field. So I'm coming from a base of where I know what success looks like. And then the context to that, I got into this, as Ted mentioned, I partially architected, project managed development of a system which became an ERP. In those days, we just called it a management information system way back in '87. Went out on my own, spoke at conference about my success. CEOs coming up to me and saying, Dr. Robertson, we like what you say, but we don't have it. Please, can you help me? So I've investigated over the years in excess of 30 failed and suboptimal ERP installations and told clients how to turn them around. And sometimes I've helped turn them around, and in some cases been a full-blown new project. I've written a book, presented over 70 executive briefings and courses. I've interviewed over 100 executives and senior managers. I've done a number of full ERP projects, which I've led with varying degrees of success over the years. And I consolidated my learnings last year into this ERP Accelerator, which is what I'm presenting to you now. Some experience. I started out fingers on the keyboard, programming, graphics, database, etc. way back. Hands-on hardware. I had hardware issues that I needed to resolve. And I've done a whole spectrum. The biggest client I've worked with was a SAP flagship site with around 60,000 employees. And I've worked with the whole spectrum of industries, the whole spectrum of ERPs. Some of my investigations have taken as long as 10 days with dozens of interviews. And the outcomes have ranged from scrapping to new procurement. And I've got a full procurement process. The reason I'm sharing all of this is that I think it's important that you understand that I'm coming to this from a very deep base of experience. And as Ted mentioned, I've come at it from a rather unusual angle as a civil engineer, trained to prevent failure, saying, why is there failure? How do we prevent failure? And that's really what we're here to talk about today. Fundamental requirements for an ERP, my consolidated view, the answers to the questions I've not yet thought to ask enable me to run the business my way. And one of the things that I pick up in the industry is clients are getting upset because they can't run the business the way they want to run it, and implementers and vendors are getting upset with the client because the client's not doing what they're supposed to do. And there's a disconnect there, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So what is the accelerator? It starts with diagnose the health of your present systems, putting in place executive custody, strategic alignment, then taking a decision whether you remediate or replace, something that I call precision configuration, and I'll explain that in a bit of detail in a few minutes. Prove it works, laboratory war games, really get it bedded down and thoroughly, properly configured and tested before you go live, a robust go live process, leading to what I call thrive. And thrive is a situation where the organization is more efficient, more profitable, and more competitive and growing. And you can look back at the end of year one and say this ERP was worth implementing. And then underpinning all of that is this thing that I call an engineering approach. So let's go into the individual components. One of the key things that I've realized many years ago is that engineers don't design bridges to stand up, they design bridges not to fall down. And many of you will remember this incident in 2007, Minneapolis, 14 people killed. And the one thing that is absolutely certain that those people who died that day did not drive onto that bridge expecting to die, because bridges just don't fall down. And we look at a landmark, Golden Gate Bridge, San Francisco, 88 years old, probably stand another 100 years, because engineers designed it not to fall down and they maintain it not to fall down. What do I mean by engineering approach? Rigor and systematic method of working, precision, focus on preventing failure. And I'm going to harp on this thing of preventing failure. One of the big errors and one of the big weaknesses of the ERP industry and the IT industry generally, is that they focus on achieving success. They don't discuss failure. It's actually unacceptable in many situations for a member of the organization to put their hand up and say, I don't think that's going to work. I think this is a risk or whatever. It's viewed as being negative, and people tell you to, just to be positive. And no, you've got to focus on the factors causing failure, because if you eliminate failure, you will have success. So the process starts with diagnose. And here's a play on my doctorate and me being the ERP doctor, because I have diagnosed so many suboptimal ERP implementation. The executive level of diagnose, executive strategic decision support 37%, business intelligence and reporting agility 30%, ERP confidence, etc. The technical components 50% precision configuration, 14% executive custody, 10% strategic alignment, and so forth. So what do I mean by custody? The ERP is transverse and cross-cutting. It touches every facet of the business. The owner of that integrated, holistic view of the business is the Chief Executive Officer, and therefore only the Chief Executive Officer can be the custodian of the ERP. As you will see from this diagram, if you put the CFO or the COO or the CIO or the C whatever in charge of the ERP, they are biased. They have to operate with the other divisions by influence. It ends up with debate and discussion and public disagreements. It doesn't work. In all the investigations that I've done, just about none of them, the Chief Executive Officer was the custodian, and that was a major factor in the problems. The projects that I've done, a number of them where the CEO was the sponsor, the custodian, gone extremely well, because of the leadership and the guidance that comes from the CEO. There's a catch. The CEO doesn't have the time or the knowledge to do the job. So you need to back the CEO up, certainly during the project, with somebody that I call the strategic project leader off to the side there. They're not an executive. They're an executive level person. They're an advisor to the CEO and an agent of the CEO. So they refer decisions up to the CEO, give the CEO advice. The CEO takes decisions, and the SPL communicates those decisions to the C-suite and the rest of the organization, and rides over the ERP implementation to make sure everything runs according to plan. A lot of talk about steering committees. I come across that continually, and quite frankly, if you found the steering committee in the cockpit of an aeroplane when you got on it, you'd get off it very, very quickly. I put a lot of emphasis on leadership. Why do I do that? Where I come from, we had military conscription. I rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel. I trained to brigade level, 5,000 all arms combatants, running a regiment of over 550 conscripts who didn't want to be there. The unit had a poor reputation when I took over, and I turned it around in 4 years with strong, light touch, visionary leadership to become a premium grade regiment. And so I learned firsthand what you can do with good leadership to totally change an organization. And that's why I put so much emphasis on leadership by the CEO of the ERP project. Bit of other context, my dad had a triple heart bypass. We're talking now 1981, when heart bypasses were relatively new stuff. It's on the table for 9 hours. He battled with his language for a year or more after that. And I was thrown in the deep end. He had clients like Union Bank of Switzerland. We had contacts in Credit Suisse and other major institutions. And we went to meetings, and he would basically introduce me, and I would take over his side of the meeting because he couldn't consistently communicate effectively. So I've been in the executive suite since 1981. I'm more comfortable talking to the CEO than I'm talking to the finance manager. And I had an interesting experience a few weeks ago. Somebody on LinkedIn was commenting on problems with an ERP implementation they'd been involved in. And I said, look, you need executive custody. You need the CEO to take charge. He said, James, most CEOs don't understand and they don't want to. I said, well, you need to educate them. He said, if I took, he said, well, what do I do if they won't? I said, well, you walk away because it's going to be a mess. And he said, well, if I did that, I wouldn't have any business. I said, okay, so what do I don't understand here? And then the penny dropped. I'm totally comfortable talking to a CEO, and the majority of practitioners are not. So we actually have got a session in 2 months' time where we're going to have a round table and get a number of senior practitioners together with myself facilitating. And we're going to have a discussion about what do you need to do in order to enroll the CEO as project custodian. And I really invite you to put that in your diary for the 21st of May on UK time. A couple of other things that came out of it. Managed to double turnover in 12 months, clever things with computers. And I learned a lot about economics and markets, which further informs my opinions. So let's talk about strategic alignment. First of all, what do we mean by strategy? What do I mean by strategy? Professor Malcolm MacDonald from Cranfield School of Management in the UK, strategy is doing the right things from the customer's perspective, and tactics is doing things right from the customer's perspective. If you do the right things well, your organization will thrive, and that's where my logo comes from. And my basic dictum is thrive by doing the right things well with ERP. MacDonald goes on to say, if you do the right things not so well, your business will survive. If you do the wrong things, it will die. And the better you get at doing the wrong things, the faster it will die. And I've seen some horrible cases with ERP. In one case, they brought me in too late to turn things around, and the company went bankrupt. In another case, the company was heading for bankruptcy, and I managed to turn it around at the 11th hour. So I have harsh, and that was, just by the way, that was JD Edwards and Deloitte. I have harsh experience of seeing how a badly implemented ERP can severely damage a business. So that's another reason why the CEO should be the custodian, because at the end of the day, if that project goes wrong, the CEO is going to be the one left holding the baby. The flip side of that is that if you do it really right and you produce a Thrive outcome, then the CEO will be the custodian of that outcome. So how do I define strategy? I researched further from MacDonald, Michael Porter, Michel Robert, and I concluded that strategy is the essence of why the organization exists and how it thrives. It's a much more embracing definition of strategy. It's intuited, it's discovered, it's not invented, it virtually never changes. Strategy is a holistic, integrated picture of how the entire organization fits together and interoperates with the environment. It's generally one sentence, and if you get that right, the project will fly. If you get in the way of it, you'll cripple the business. So let's elaborate a bit on this thing of the essence. So the essential reason the organization exists, its core economic driver, how it uses people, how its market differentiate, core customer, etc. You need to have a holistic view of how that business succeeds, how it got to where it got today, how it has the money to invest in an ERP project. If you don't understand all of these things and you do not encapsulate them in the project design, you're setting yourself up for a suboptimal outcome. Strategic snapshots. One of the things I discovered way back was that there was a lack of effective strategic planning methods. So I developed this thing that I call a strategic snapshot, which gives you ultimately a weighted gap and allows you to focus on the 20% of activities that will deliver 80% of the value. One of the things that comes out of that is a numeric rating of the relative importance of critical factors. And you'll see the case there, the first item there, leadership. The first person says it's 31% of what's important. The sixth person says it's 8%. So we've got divergent views around the table, and those divergent views are real and they're legitimate, because everybody comes to the mountain in a different way. And if we look at installing an ERP as climbing a mountain and the objective is to get to the top of the mountain, the reality is that CEO, CFO, CMO, COO, CIO, HR all see the mountain differently. So if you don't do anything to measure that divergence, as I've just shown you, then everybody's pulling in different directions. You get these meetings that go nowhere because nobody can agree on the priorities. So what you do is the process that I've just touched on, and you agree one way up the mountain, one set of priorities. And that's an absolutely fundamental point of getting the project out on the right footing. One of the other outputs of that is what I call the strategic trajectory. Here we see a pretty mediocre ERP. Looking back 3 years, 4 out of 10. Today, 4.1 out of 10. If we keep going the way we're going, we might make it to 4.7 out of 10. But we want to be at 7, and we believe we can get to 7. So that gives us a strategic gap, which we can work to close. So everything that we're talking about here is tangible, measurable, actionable. If we look at the overall project approach, top-down strategy focused is what I'm advocating. And frankly, folks, I have to say to you, there is only one way to implement strategy, and that is from the top down. You've got to sit with the C-suite, determine what the strategy is, determine what the strategic priorities are, and then you've got to work that down through your project. If you do that, you will get strategic focus, which engages 20% of the effort to deliver 80% of the investment value. If you do it the conventional ERP way, starting with processes with mid-level managers and trying to work upwards, you're going to end up somewhere which is not going to be where you need to be at the heart of the essence of the business. And the result is you will employ 80% of the effort to deliver 20% of the value. And a huge reason why so many ERP projects do not deliver value is what's on the screen right now. So that brings us to decision. And I want you to notice that we are now on step 4 before we make a decision. So the decision is, do we replace, do we remediate, do we re-implement? The icebergs there give you some idea, my estimation of the relative cost. On the left, new ERP using the traditional approach, cost factor of 1. To the right, using the accelerator, 0.8, re-implementing with the accelerator, 0.6. But if you remediate, you're looking at about 0.05 to 0.4. It is much cheaper to remediate. And then to put that in context, I want to identify, define something that I call an IBIS, an Integrated Business Information System. And that's what you see on the screen. This diagram is about 20 years old. I've been talking about it for that long. And what you see is you have this whole mosaic of different systems and bits of technology, etc., that make up the way an organization manages data. You take that ERP out, you rip it out, and you destroy everything on that diagram. So to put in a new ERP, you have to rebuild everything that's on that diagram. Therefore, you need to be very, very circumspect about whether you replace your ERP versus you remediate. Going further, this is a rough list of all the things that get broken when you trash an ERP and all the things that you have to do to put in a new ERP. And so we're talking about the real cost of replacing an ERP is something like 5 to 10 times the budgeted cost. So again, if you're going to replace an ERP, you need to be very sure of your case. So I've talked about these icebergs a minute ago, just to reiterate, it's much cheaper to remediate. And that's a whole conversation. As I say, all of this, I could talk for ages. So let's talk about this thing that I call precision configuration. What exactly is it? It'll turbocharge any ERP, including what you've got. And in the context of what I shared a couple of minutes ago about strategic alignment, if you get the strategic alignment right, you're doing 20% of the work that will deliver 80% of the value. So if you've got an ERP that's implemented the traditional way, you've done 80% of the work to deliver 20% of the value, then just invest the remaining 20% of the work to deliver 80% of the value. This is based on an interview with the CEO of a FTSE 100 company, 60,000 employees, running a flagship SAP implementation. And I sat in the executive office of the CEO and I said, Neville, how would you rate SAP? He said, James, operationally, I'd give it 7 or 8 out of 10. The business is running well, but at a strategic executive level, I'd give it 1 out of 10. I have 4 senior accountants with teams of people working with them, spending 3 weeks a month in Excel because they can't get the information they need out of SAP and the data warehouse and business objects. And I'll show you with you in a minute why that was. I just want to take a sidestep here, a metaphor for precision configuration. So you've done well in life. You've got a really nice house. You've got a really nice front door. You need some screws for to mount the front door. So you go into a hardware store and you expect to find the screws neatly arranged in racks. So you go to the rack, get the screws you need, and go and pay for them. But instead, you find that the sales assistant says, I've got this drum of fasteners. I'll tip it out on the floor, and here's John, our screw find consultant. He only charges $105 an hour. I'm sure he'll find the screws for you. You turn around and walk out and go to another store. But why do we put up with that when we're dealing with ERP? So what do I mean? This is the chart of accounts for that FTSE 100 company. There's absolutely no logic. There's no structure. Scraping, loading, dosing, ripping, and grading are a huge subject, and it doesn't belong in the chart of accounts. Medicines next to water treatment chemicals, explosives next to gas stores. Absolutely meaningless rubbish in a huge corporation that is spending a fortune on an army of people to unscramble this mess. This is what it should look like. This is a chart of accounts that I developed for a manufacturing company. And what you'll notice there is the hierarchical indents, the capital letters for structure, not for posting. The posting level accounts roughly about 7 items per category in the structure. And you'll notice the trailing periods in the codes, which mirror the index. That's a 10 out of 10 as far as I'm concerned. And what that allows you to do, this is filtering in Excel, but you can do it with any reporting tool. I'm filtering on the trailing periods in the code and double-click, drill down, double-click, drill down, double-click, drill down, double-click, drill down. And you can do that with any reporting tool. And what I want you to see is that is a huge improvement. And so we see on the left, the worst chart of accounts I've ever seen. Client went out of business before I could turn it around. On the right, another example of what I've just been talking about. To put that into context, the average ERP that I've seen is implemented in terms of this thing that I call precision configuration at the bottom left of this curve. If you push it right to a high level of precision, you unlock huge benefits. The ERP behaves differently, it seems differently, it's easier to use, you can produce reports quickly and easily. It's a different world, folks, and you need to see it to believe it. One of the things that allows you to do, and I touched on this with V3, the cubic business model, which gives you a very, very powerful way of looking at your data, and this is purely a code structure in the chart of accounts and in the dimensions. So then the next step is prove it works, a laboratory in war games, and that's just any room with some computers in. And what you do is you exercise the software in every possible way with every possible situation. What do I mean by a laboratory? An engineering laboratory is a place where you simulate the real world. Fundamental components, war games, break it till you can't break it any longer, specify workflow, cleanse master data, build up representative test data. Might be 0.01% of the total body of data, but it's every possible scenario, every unusual product, every unusual customer, carefully selected. Build a full portfolio of reports and business intelligence models, document standards, etc., and train every single user through war games. You would not put an unlicensed person in a 16-wheeler, 40-ton articulated lorry, give them a half-hour PowerPoint, drive them around a vacant parking lot for half an hour and send them out on the road. You'd kill people. Why do you do that when you train people to use an ERP? So then make it work. And what that looks like is the culmination is the CEO standing in front of the project team. And what you see in front of him is a pile of signed certificates which say, I, the undersigned, hereby certified that I have thoroughly evaluated and inspected all areas, And there's a clear understanding that this gentleman is going to be extremely unhappy if you've put your signature on that document and it turns out that you were mistaken. So you're talking about a tough decision. You do not go live until you are absolutely sure that it is going to run perfectly. And I see time after time after time reports of substandard ERP implementations where it is clear that what I'm just talking about was not done. They went live, it was not properly tested, they had weeks and weeks of hypercare, which is just another way of saying that the implementation was poorly handled. If you do it the way I'm talking about, you get a Thrive outcome. What do I mean by a Thrive outcome? Management of all facets of the business is tighter, the business is more lean and more agile. You have improved productivity, profitability, increased competitiveness and growth. And you look back after a year and say, this has really benefited us to put in this ERP. So recap, how do we do that? Diagnose, custody, align, decision, prove it works, make it work, and thrive. All of that based on a foundation of an engineering approach. So we have eliminated failure and therefore we have achieved success. So to learn more, I have a 5-hour executive briefing, which is primarily targeted at client executives. So if you've got a client who you think would benefit, please feel free to nominate them. And I have a 4-day course both for practitioners and for clients where you will go into this in extreme depth. You'll get a complete document pack, job descriptions, charters, checklists, etc. And we can discuss favorable commercial arrangements. So that's my story.